family of shows. Available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We're our fourth segment of the day here. We're continuing with the narrative positional rankings, continuing with the wide receiver position, a position that has seen a lot of volatility throughout the season. A lot of frustration for several fantasy football managers here in my chat, Andre included, trying to figure out and juggle the wide receiver position. But hopefully this segment, week in, week out, helps you in terms of setting your lineup, because I always try and give you the best advice based off, of course, matchups, but also because of the volatility of the position, especially with the wide receivers here. Without further ado, I'm going to talk about the four guys who I think will have good games. Starting off with the guy who, week in, week out, you always have to trust, but he's going to have weird games depending on how the Bengals look each week. But this week, I feel he's going to have a big one. Jamar Chase. Their first divisional game against the hapless, god-awful Cleveland Browns. Now, against a pretty average defense in the New York Giants, he had a quiet game. Did Jamar Chase, 12.2 fantasy points. But this is a defense that should be reeling in the Cleveland Browns. As Andre said, man, if I had Rashee Rice still. Imagine. I feel your pain, Andre, because we have very similar teams and very similar players. And so I could be sitting here saying that I potentially have one of the better fantasy wide receiver groups in my league. But now I'm kind of stuck relying on Amon-Ra St. Brown to heat up at some point and Garrett Wilson to still get the touches I think he deserves. And if I had Rashee Rice, all those problems probably would go away. So it's still something that you still kind of have to say it is what it is and try and get on with it. But, you know, wide receiver is such a versatile position that you can find anyone, basically, to try and replace them. But Jamar Chase, going back to him, this is just a game that he should dominate in. Because if I'm the Browns defense, I can't get enough stops to truly account for the ineptitudes of my offense. That's basically what I'm thinking here if I'm the Cleveland Browns. And not for nothing, I feel like the Browns defense as a whole has lost its luster a little bit. They still have the star players, but they don't necessarily have the edge they had last year. Maybe it's because of the offense, but it certainly feels like there's something deeper going on with the Browns on both sides of the football that's kind of limiting what they're doing. And not for nothing, it's truly affecting what I think of this team. If, you know, the defense was the number one unit in the league and the offense was inept. Because at least if one of their units was top tier as perhaps number one in the entire league, then perhaps it would be more forgiving of the other unit. But since both of them, one is god-awful and the other is just about league average, then I really can't forgive what the Cleveland Browns are. If they can't accept themselves, then I don't really know what they're like going forward. So expect Jamar Chase to have a big game here. Really, you know, it's all going to depend on the Bengals' game plan here, because we've seen that they can win ugly now, as they did against the Giants on Monday. But going forward, Jamar Chase is just someone who, if you're a fantasy football manager and if you have him in your lineup, you're saying, okay, I feel like the Bengals' offense is going to do pretty well given the circumstances of what they are. And Jamar Chase is still a top receiver. Someone that's going to put him and pencil him in every single week. But just because of this specific matchup, I'm saying that he should have even bigger numbers than what we could have ever expected from him, because, yet again, it is the Browns here. But then the next guy I want to talk about, kind of touched upon a little bit with the whole Washington situation. Terry McLaurin also going with the Panthers. Held his own, actually, in that Baltimore game with 23.3 fantasy points. But I feel like the thing about Terry McLaurin that people don't understand is that as the wide receiver one in Washington, he wears a lot of different hats. Because in this system, yes, it's a college-style system meant to get the ball downfield, but it also relies a lot upon the decision-making of Jaden Daniels. So all the things we've seen with the rapport built between Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin, is really the result of these two players playing it by ear. It's all trust. And in games such as this, against a very easy opponent, that's going to be very clear and apparent to people now. Against the Baltimore Ravens, it may not have been as crystal clear because it was still a tough physical game, and they were up against it. But against this game, against the Panthers, I feel like it's going to be made clear that this relationship that Daniels and McLaurin is building is special, because both of these guys are really doing this on their own, really figuring each other out on their own, most importantly, leading their team to victories. And against an easy schedule, that's what you need to do. That's what you need to do. You need to go in there, beat up on opponents, and get the win. Keep yourselves in control of this race. Because that's how I see the Washington Commanders now. If they can keep control, do their job, and in this divisional games, at least split them or win the majority of them, they're true contenders in the NFC. And Terry McLaurin is a big reason why. Then the next guy I want to talk about, the third guy here that I want to talk about in a very important game that we talked about a little bit on the other side of things. Stephon Diggs for the Packers. 19.7 points against New England. Really kind of stepped up as the wide receiver one in Nico Collins' absence. Going to have to do it again. Going to have to do it for a very least 4 consecutive weeks as Nico Collins sits out on the IR. But in this game especially, I think about the Texans' offensive game plan is going to look like. I feel like the Packers' defense, especially in their secondary, they're paper tigers in that they kind of cover up their coverage skills with the fact they're really good at taking the football away. Not to say that it's an indictment of Jair Alexander and Xavier McKinney, but I still feel like you can exploit this Packers secondary a little bit. And not for nothing, their front hasn't been as scary as I expected it to be. So if you feel like you can attack them, and you attack them from the word go, then I feel like CJ Stroud could have a field day here, could turn this into a shootout, could play this game to the Texans' advantage. And so Stephon Diggs is going to have to be just as good at the start of this game, because when you establish that connection and you get going and you put points on the board, it puts a lot of pressure on this defense. So Stephon Diggs, I don't know why I said Wiggs, kind of wins this matchup early on, then it could be a long day for the Packers defense. And a defense that I feel like has been covering up a lot of its issues certainly is going to have a lot of glaring questions answered about them in this matchup. Should Stephon Diggs kind of grab it by the horns here? But that's just my opinion, because we all know how volatile Stephon Diggs can be week in, week out. And if you know this game doesn't go well for the Texans, if they fall behind perhaps, then we'll certainly see the true side of this Texans offense, sans Nico Collins. But I still think he's going to be a major factor, whether it's positively or negatively. As Andre said, taking all CJ Stroud overs, I would agree. And as a Packers fan, I agree with you even more, because, talking about your Packers, then you would know that I might be right in this regard, Andre, as Dallas should have a great game too. I agree there too. But Will Casper is back in the chat as well. Before we go to a quick break, actually, I do want to bring up one more receiver before we go to a quick break, but I will address Will's comment here. What's up? I have a lot of receivers and good running backs. So I trade Mike Evans, Ayuk, and Chubb for CeeDee Lamb. I'm 5-1 and don't really need those guys. I could also do Amon-Ra and Chubb for CD. As Andre said, 5-1, bro, you chillin', man. I would agree. Listen, and as Andre says, that's too much for CD, in my opinion. I completely agree. At 5-1, with all those guys, yes, you might be saying, okay, I can pack it in a little bit, but you should never pack it in fantasy football. I mean, CeeDee Lamb's a special receiver talent, don't get me wrong, but he's not special enough to give out that many players for him. The Amon-Ra Chubb trade, I could see, but I feel like this depth is such going to be so important when you reach the playoffs in fantasy. Because in the playoffs in fantasy, you don't know how many injuries will have been sustained by your players over a single season. So you always have to account for, how that's going to work out in the future when you really want to win your league. If you trade away a lot of value here, like guys like Evans and Ayuk, who in the future could really help you come playoff time, then it will look really silly if you just said, okay, I'm packing it in because I have a good record. I feel like I'm going to make the playoffs. I feel like I'm in a position where I can start to offload guys. So I definitely wouldn't have, as Will Casper says, I still have Jaden Reed and Tank Dell. But then again, I still don't think that's enough, as Will Casper says, and Cup. See, I feel like all your receivers have value. But if you offload all of these guys and only have Reed, Dell, and Cup, it's not the best receiving corps if you actually want to win your league. If you just want to have a good record, then by all means, offload them. What I'm saying here is all of this depth will matter come fantasy playoff time. And if I feel like in the future, when you have already clinched a playoff spot, you just want to offload dead weight, then that's the time. But not in the middle of the season when you're building momentum and you can outplay these guys and you have the depth to do it. And we have the depth to tinker with your lineups week in and week out. So that's why I feel like this matchup or this trade rather, is one that I wouldn't be willing to take, as Andre also kind of agrees with my sentiment by saying your team's insane. So don't give up a good thing just for the sake of packing it in a little bit, because that could hurt you in the future down the line. But I do want to bring up one more receiver here in my fantasy rankings with Mike Evans against the Ravens. Only 5.4 fantasy points, as I thank you, Will, for your comment. We're going back to Mike Evans here. I think he's going to have a decent game. I think that this Bucs-Ravens game is going to be the shootout of the week, flex to Monday Night Football, and not for nothing, the Bucs will prove that at the very least they can contend as thanks man, 10 man, a great start. I feel like that's a perfect example of why you need the depth, man. But thank you to you as well for your comment. But quickly to round this segment before we take a quick break here, Mike Evans is just someone who I really think adds a lot of value to this team. And if that the report is saying, especially with Nico out, Dell's value is super high, I agree as well. Tank Dell will have a big game. And we'll talk about this a little bit in our next segment, my shadow report. But overall, just wanted to give you these four guys as my receivers for this week. But coming up on the other side, I'm going to be talking about my weekly shadow report and some of the wide receiver cornerback matchups you might want to look out for in terms of picking your fantasy roster. So we'll be right back after this short break.